Hey, Ivy, thanks for being with us. We'll wait a few minutes. We aren't quite at that 12:30 mark yet, but you have entered the How to Win Against Austerity and Invest in Prosperity session for our 2022 KY Policy Conference, and thanks for being here.
Hi, folks. Welcome to our session about Kentucky's austerity policies, why tax and budget cutting hurts us, and how we can chart a better course forward. My name is Anna Baumann. I'm the Deputy Director here at KY Policy, and I'm really glad that you're all here with us today. I'm moderating this session, and so we'll get us started off with some notes about how today's session will flow and some introductions of our guests. Before we get to that, I wanted to say if you meant to attend the safety net panel, which is happening concurrently with this session, I'm going to put the details for that panel in the chat so that you can make your way over there. And note that there's also a password here for you. All right, so with that taken care of, it's my honor to host today what I know will be a lively, informative, and challenging session. Why challenging? Well, because as a person who's focused on both the policy analysis side and the communication side of fiscal policy, I know how big a hill we're climbing when we're trying to advance good tax policy and robust investments in communities. It's always difficult, and we have a special opportunity this session. As you know, Kentucky has a huge budget surplus, which could be used to reinvest in communities after so many budget areas have been deeply and painfully cut over the last decade, to help Kentuckians who are still struggling in the pandemic and to invest in an equitable recovery from the pandemic. So the question is, will the Kentucky General Assembly do that, or will they squander those resources on more tax cuts and sideline those resources in an unnecessarily large rainy day fund? Those are the choices that the Kentucky General Assembly has ahead of them. And if you're here today, it's because you are hopeful with us that we make the right choices and pave the way towards a better economy for all Kentuckians. If you're here today, it's also likely because you know one of the most important things we can do to shift the ground towards better policy is to engage in constructive conversation about these issues. So today we'll remind ourselves of what's at stake, what the research says about what actually works to build thriving communities, and we'll learn about and practice how to build more constructive narratives. So I'm going to tell you about how our 90 minutes together will flow, including a little bit about each of our experts. And I'm going to drop another thing in the chat here. So if you want to read more about our experts, you can go to our program there. In a couple minutes, my colleague, our senior policy analyst, Pam Thomas, will get us started. Pam joined us in 2017 after a long career in state government as the committee staff administrator for the Appropriations and Revenue Committee in the General Assembly. Tax policy, budgeting, education, finance, workforce, criminal justice, and juvenile justice. These are all areas in her wheelhouse. The KY policy team hardly goes, 30 minutes without saying that's a Pam question. She's our resident expert on so many things. So she's going to be setting the scene for us today with a look at the recent history of tax and budget cutting policies in Kentucky and how it has impacted us. After Pam, Whitney Tucker, Deputy Director of Research at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, will join us with a national perspective on tax and budget cutting policy choices. How do these policies play out for states across the nation? And what are successful states doing instead? For the Center on Budget, Whitney conducts research on state tax and budget policies with a focus on how to advance racial and economic justice. Before joining the center, she worked on anti-poverty policy in state-level child advocacy organizations, such as NC Child. After Whitney's presentation, Remy Trupin will join us. Remy is Senior Fellow at the Topos Partnership, where he uses his revenue and budget expertise, including from his past life as a founding director of a state policy org like ours, to inform communications challenges we face in our work. He and his team provide incredible support to organizations trying to cut through the noise of harmful narratives around trickle-down economics and other critical topics to help us learn how to tell a more accurate story about how our economy works in ways that land with the audiences that we're trying to reach. In his presentation, he'll share some best practices for talking about these issues. After our three experts speak, there will be time for questions before we break for 10 minutes. Then after that, we'll come back with time to discuss and engage with each other around practicing how to talk about these issues. Like I said, I'm sure this will be a very lively and I hope interactive session. Please use the chat if you have any questions about technical aspects of what you're trying to do today. Use the Q&A to share questions that you have throughout the expert presentations. And then again, when we have time for questions after they're finished with those presentations. And later on, when we come back from our break, we'll also have an opportunity to hear from the audience, where I'll invite people to come off mute by raising their hands and to share their how you're talking about these issues. Okay, so with that, I am going to hand it over to Pam and hope for no technical difficulties.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. If you watched the budget overview earlier today, this is probably going to be a little bit of a repeat for you, and some of the slides are going to be the same as I set the stage for our session today, with an overview of where we are right now in Kentucky from a revenue and budgeting standpoint and how we got here. And where we are right now, honestly, is probably a little bit confusing to everyone, because we have record revenue surpluses, an unprecedented amount in our rainy day fund, and a forecast that projects continued revenue growth moving forward. Yet despite all of this, one of the prevailing messages from our legislators is still that we need to continue the same austerity mindset that has dominated us for the past several years in Kentucky, and continue with the tax cuts, a mindset that has promoted year after year of new cuts, resulting in 20 rounds of budget cuts, and that have made it very, very difficult for the state of Kentucky to fund state government and to operate effectively and efficiently. And now I'm going to go ahead. So this is a slide that just illustrates what I would call some of the low points in Kentucky's revenue history. And this just is, it's picking out some of the significant tax cuts beginning with House Bill 44, which was the property tax limit in 1979, and taking us all the way up through the 2018 and 2019 legislative sessions. And what all of these tax cuts have done is have eroded our tax base over time. And if I tried to put them all on there, it would be a slide that you could not even begin to read, because there would be so many things on it. So this is really just the timeline. And so once again, I am going to this happened to me last time too, where I could not advance my PowerPoint. Here we go. So from a revenue standpoint, session after session, new tax cuts have been enacted. And in the recent years, those cuts have shifted who pays from those at the top to those at the bottom, and it makes our system much more regressive. And as this slide shows, the tax changes in 2008, which reduced the income tax rate and expanded the sales tax base, resulted in a very significant shift of who pays taxes, disproportionately impacting rural communities and people of color who are overrepresented in the lower income levels because of the way our rig economy works to create and perpetuate inequality. And so this isn't in my prepared remarks, but it struck me yesterday when I was watching the A&R committee meeting and the debate on the budget on the House floor yesterday afternoon, that Chairman Petrie was talking about in his mind that the best way to benefit all Kentuckians is by doing a tax cut. But if you look at this graph and you think about how that all works, the poorest Kentuckians don't pay the income tax because they're excluded. And so if we do a further shift from the income tax to the sales tax, it actually hurts poor people more than it does anyone else, and they actually do not benefit at all, and in fact are harmed by it. And so I think this graph is particularly illustrative of that, and I think that just based on the rhetoric that we're hearing right now, that that's going to be what they're saying, is the tax cut is the way to give it back to everybody. But what this graph shows is that that is clearly not true. And once again, I don't really know what's going on here. But my slides are not advancing. All right, well, I'm just going to go on anyway and act like you can see my slides, which you can't. So the next slide that I was going to show you compares who pays income taxes and who pays sales taxes. And what that clearly shows is sort of the same thing that this graph does, in that the people who are on the bottom pay a lot more in sales taxes than they do in income taxes, and that further shifts in that direction really just end up making things harder for people at the bottom. And the reason that it works this way is because those at the bottom spend more of what they earn to meet their daily expenses, while those at the top have more discretionary money to do with as they please. And those at the very bottom who make too little, which I already mentioned this earlier, do not pay income taxes at all, but they end up paying a disproportionate amount of consumption taxes. So the other thing is that as the rich get richer, they don't buy more stuff. So Natalie, are you sharing my slides?
Yes, I am. Tell me where I
Okay.
should go.
Go to the fifth one, the one that has tax expenditures take priority over the budget. And thank you for helping me out. Now, if we look at just the past few years, as I noted previously, the big shifts beginning in 2018 and 2019. Since that time, the General Assembly has passed over 100 million more in cuts, primarily in two bills with tax provisions that were considered and passed in one day with no public meetings and no comment at all. And the big winners in these rounds were once again corporations and businesses, with the biggest winners among them all being banks, which received an average cut of 50% beginning this year. And I want to emphasize that this seems to be the new way that the General Assembly is operating, particularly with tax bills, is that we see them introduced and passed in one day in a meeting that usually is in a conference committee, which means that there aren't the ability for the public to come in and testify. So in 2021, with COVID pandemic continuing and revenues remaining uncertain, they came in again and passed another 661 million in tax cuts. And it's important to note that these cuts, they're also known as tax expenditures, take priority over anything else in the budget. Because what happens is when you have a tax expenditure, it just cuts the revenue available. So the people that benefit from that get paid before the first dollar of state money is spent. And this slide that's up there now lists just a few of the tax breaks that have reduced our revenues over time. And so what this all means, Natalie, if you could go to the next slide, please, is that the growth in our state revenues have not kept pace with the growth in our economy. And as illustrated in this slide, revenues have dropped from a high of 7.3% to 5.7% of our economy. And as a percentage, that might not seem that large, but in an economy the size of Kentucky, that's over $3 billion. And that would be an amount above even our historic surpluses to spend this year if our tax base had simply kept pace with the growth in our economy. But this cannot and will not happen so long as the General Assembly continues to cut taxes. Natalie, if you could then go to the next slide, thank you. Before moving on to a brief overview of the shortfalls in the budget, I want to briefly look at where we are now with revenues and why it's important to pay attention to recurring versus one-time monies. And right now, Kentucky has an abundance, relatively speaking, of both. That's a great position to be in this session. As this slide shows, we have close to $3 billion in new revenues expected this year compared to 2020, and revenue growth is projected to continue in the future, although at a more moderate rate, with the consensus group predicting 294 million in 23 and 598 million in 24. So what this means is if this is recurring money, it can be spent on recurring expenditures, which means that it can be used to prop up the budget and to start to reinvest in all of those agencies and areas that have been underinvested in for so many years. Okay, Natalie, if you want to go ahead to the next slide. So now I'm just going to do a very, very brief overview of where we are from a budgetary standpoint and where we are. We are where we are primarily because of the austerity mindset that our General Assembly has had and because we've had year after year of tax cuts. This slide illustrates where general fund resources are budgeted, and note that when federal funds are included, this allocation changes and Medicaid is the biggest expense, but that's because Medicaid is primarily a federally funded program. This slide is looking at what state dollars pay for, and as you can see, P-12 education is by far the largest appropriation. What you can also see is that the criminal system is the third largest expenditure area, and unlike the other areas, which have generally been cut or flatlined over the past several budgets, the criminal system budget is growing in large part because the General Assembly continues to criminalize more behavior, lengthen sentences, and incarcerate more Kentuckians, even as other states are making meaningful reforms leading to reduced incarceration and healthier, safer communities. Natalie, if you could go to the next slide. So as I noted, our biggest state funding area is P-12 education, and schools have received a significant amount of federal COVID relief funding, which has helped them to adapt and to continue providing services to their children and families during the pandemic. But state funding, especially the core per pupil funding, remains inadequate and is growing more inequitable. The base guarantee, which is the basic per pupil funding we often hear discussed, is currently $4,000 per student in the budget. And now this is a really important point about education funding that I want to make sure everybody understands. The base guarantee is funded through a combination of both state and local funds. So that whole $4,000 is not state money. The state contributes more to districts that have less property wealth and therefore less ability to raise revenue locally. And that's the equalization that tries to make sure that all of the kids in Kentucky have the same resources for their education. The state portion has declined on a per pupil basis by $191 between 2008 and 2002. Well, the local portion grew by $368. That means the expense of educating children has shifted to the local folks. Thus, the cost of the nominal increase in base funding is being borne primarily by local school districts. And in addition, those numbers don't account for inflation. Once we take inflation into account, and that's what this graph shows, the per pupil guarantee is lower in 2022 than it was in 2020 and 2008 by $682 a student. And that's a decline of 16.1%. So contrary to what you're hearing about historic funding, you need to take into account the time value of money and understand that it actually is not an increase. The state portion, it's even worse, is lower by $921 a student. And if you could go to the next one, Natalie. In other areas with education, the state has never fully funded the cost of transportation, despite a statute requiring that they do so. This year in the current budget, transportation is funded at about 55%. There's been no money for professional development or textbooks for many years. And there was one small bright spot in 2021, which has been continued in both the governor's budget and the House proposed budget, and that is the funding of full day kindergarten. Most districts were doing that anyway, and so having that money to actually reimburse them for it does give them some money for extra uses. And there's a lot more that I could say about the lack of funding for education, but in the interest of time, I'm going to close this portion with this slide, which shows the gap in funding between the wealthiest and poorest districts. And this is oops, sorry, Natalie, can you go back? Yeah, there you go. And what this shows, if you look all the way to the left on that slide, that was the difference in revenue per student for the wealthiest and the poorest districts. And as you can see, if you go all the way then over to the other side, we're almost back there. This is the level that the court said in the Rose decision was unconstitutional and that the General Assembly needed to do something else, which resulted in CARA. Okay, Natalie, now the next slide. Moving on to a few other areas where a lack of funding is having a significant impact. And I want to note here that there are so many areas that I won't specifically be able to mention because almost every area of state government has less money now than they'd had 10 years ago, from the Department of Public Advocacy to the Department of Revenue. State agencies are all doing more with less, and for many, the COVID pandemic has highlighted further just how much the lack of investment has compromised their ability to provide services. It has become, and this has been in the news a lot with some specific sectors of state government, but it's really true all across state government. It's become increasingly difficult for state government to hire and retain employees. Salaries that don't keep pace with the public sector and reduced pension and health benefits have all contributed. Positions where shortages are creating serious backlogs and serious issues include social workers and people who work in juvenile justice and correctional facilities. These classifications all received a 10% salary increase in December through executive branch action, and that is good, but it is not sufficient for the sizable catch-up that is needed. State salaries have lost significant ground compared to the private sector. As this slide illustrates, between 2010 and 2020, the private sector salaries have increased by 11.6% and adjusted for inflation, while state salaries have declined by 1% over the same period. So you don't need to be a math wizard to know that these dynamics just don't really work if you're trying to hire and retain people. They just don't work. We recently published a paper on this topic, if you want to know more about it, where we get into a little bit more detail. But it's just kind of true and important to say that many state agencies simply can no longer deliver the services they're charged with because they simply can't hire people. And if they do hire them, the workloads are so huge that they don't stay for very long. A couple of other issues I want to just mention very, very quickly. Childcare, that was mentioned this morning as well. Over half of Kentucky's children live in a childcare desert where it's either unavailable or there are far more children than there are openings. And it's mainly due to a decrease in the number of providers in the state. Kentucky has lost 46% of its providers over the last 10 years. There's a program called CCAP that provides assistance for childcare payments to family, but it falls far short of meeting needs. Significant federal investments as part of COVID have shown what significant investment can do and has temporarily and thankfully stopped the shuttering of facilities. But without sustained investment, when these funds run out, the backsliding will continue. And as we all know, there are huge ripple effects in our economy when childcare isn't affordable and available. And Kentucky has also failed to adequately invest in post-secondary education, with funding declining 33% since 2008, considering inflation. This also has large ripple effects and has resulted in more students having more debt, making it difficult for them to get ahead once they graduate. Kentucky ranks 6th worst among all the states for college affordability, and the median student loan debt in Kentucky is around $18,000, and more than 125,000 Kentuckians owe more than $50,000. And so when you think about this and you think about economic development and you think about the way they talk about tax cuts as the way to do economic development, well, I'll tell you what, if you can get rid of people's debt and if you can provide childcare, I think that goes a lot further towards improving your economy than cutting taxes. Just like tax giveaways to the wealthy and well-connected that end up increasing what lower income people pay in taxes, so did the budget side impacts of austerity fall hardest on those low-income people. Better off Kentuckians can more easily afford private goods in the absence of healthy public services, but when our schools, childcare centers, healthcare and human services struggle to provide the services our communities ultimately rely on, people of color, rural communities, people with disabilities, women-headed household, and other groups dealing with race, gender, location, and other disparities are locked out of that thriving. Austerity policies on both sides of the coin, tax and budget, increase inequality and prevent shared prosperity. There's a whole lot more I could say about this, but I think you get the picture. The austerity mindset has led to significant tax cuts year after year, and the promised trickle down as a result of the cuts has instead flowed back up, making those who are already wealthy even wealthier and causing those already struggling to make their ends meet, making it even more difficult for them. This lack of resources has resulted in underinvestment in all the areas of state government, and we are now at the point that there are critical shortages and deficits that cannot be addressed without significant investments. Yet, as I noted at the beginning, we're still hearing that the plan includes more tax cuts and less investment that's needed, despite the fact that we are in an unprecedented situation of having what we actually need to make these investments. So these are the austerity threats that we face. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Whitney to provide some context for all of this for us from a national perspective.
Thank you so much, Pam. You have really teed up what I have to share today perfectly, because what you're seeing in Kentucky is not isolated, right? So as this year's state legislative season really kicks off, Kentucky is definitely not alone among the states in weighing really costly income tax cuts and other austerity measures that would primarily, I'm sorry, I just realized that folks can see my notes. Let me try again, guys.
I was trying to grab you and it was difficult.
I appreciate it. How about now? Is that better?
Yes, it is.
All right. Whoops. Not better on my end. Now I can't. Just a moment. But in any case, I'll go ahead and start by saying, but they are weighing really costly income tax cuts and other austerity measures that would just primarily benefit wealthy households and really profitable corporations, more so than lower and middle income citizens who really need it. So this has been going on for decades. These efforts to buy wealthy interests in large corporations and their allies in state capitals to really push tax cuts and budget measures that aren't actually yielding the economic benefits that they promised, but are instead really undermining state revenue systems, which has limited revenues in ways that harm programs that help families with low to moderate incomes, ways that could potentially expand opportunity in communities of color, and ways that support really crucial services like public schools and colleges, parks, public health, and infrastructure. And so despite already really extreme levels of economic inequality and robust corporate benefits that we have seen over the last 2 years, these folks are still trying again, and Kentucky should definitely not take that bait. Let's see if this works. All right, can folks see my notes now?
Looks good now. This looks good for us.
All right, perfect. So main takeaway that I want folks to leave here today with is that from the national perspective, looking at what's happened in multiple states over the last few decades, big tax cuts don't boost state economies or help families thrive. Instead, since states have to balance their budgets and offset the lost revenue, they just invariably lead to really big funding cuts in core public assets. That means less support for schools and hospitals, less available revenue for investments that broaden opportunity, and outsized gains for wealthy households and large companies at the expense of racial and economic justice. And it also leads to communities and local economies that ultimately become less attractive to businesses and families. So Pam's comments touched a little bit on this, but I want to go into it a bit more for folks who may not understand how progressive personal income taxes really have helped to broaden our tax base and also to create more equity in the tax space. And so how cutting those taxes really hurts equity in our communities. But I'll say that first off, broad-based personal income taxes are the greatest source of revenue in most states, and they're followed really closely by general sales taxes, which is the same situation that you guys face in Kentucky. This is really problematic from a perspective of racial and ethnic equity because most state tax systems also ask the most as a share of their income of lower income households versus households with higher income. And those lower income households are disproportionately households of color all across the country. And so because income taxes are progressive in most states, which means that higher rates are paid by those with higher incomes, white families, which are 3 times likelier than Black families and Latino families to be in the top 1% of earners, those families benefit the most from cuts in those state income taxes. In contrast, regressive taxes, especially sales taxes and fees, fall more on low and moderate income people, leaving them to shoulder a higher percentage of their earnings toward the public good. So there are several decades worth of evidence to back up my claims here about how these cuts really just do not help. So in the mid to late 1990s and into 2000 and 2001, state revenue collections grew substantially as a result of just unusually high, and as it turned out, unsustainably high levels of economic activity, particularly personal consumption and capital gains realizations. So based on the revenue forecast that assumed that revenue growth would continue at or near the levels of the late 1990s, 43 states used those temporary levels of revenue growth to finance really largely permanent tax cuts in 1994 through 2001. Those big tax cuts did not contribute to state fiscal and economic health. In fact, when the economy started to weaken again in 2001 and states fell into a fiscal crisis, those big tax cutting states generally faced larger fiscal problems and had worse economic performance than other states that have been more cautious about making those cuts. And we saw it again in the early 2000s. Here you see that most states that enacted really large tax cuts from 2001 to 2007 didn't actually see strong job growth after those took effect, even though that's what they had been promised by all of the pro-tax cut folks in state houses. And then again, we saw this happen after the Great Recession. So after the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, there were a lot of claims that cutting taxes was the solution that was going to increase economic growth and That was really pushed especially hard in states like Kansas and Ohio, and their lawmakers were urged to slash personal or corporate or both income taxes. And many of them took up the proponents of tax cuts on that, unfortunately. Those cuts just didn't deliver the promised economic boost, and the resulting revenue shortfalls forced schools to shift more costs onto parents and teachers, as Pam was mentioning. It pushed up tuition for college students. It left millions of people without health insurance, and it caused delays in infrastructure projects like highway repairs, just among other harms. So a few examples of what we saw after the Great Recession. In Arizona, revenue losses from 2 decades of state tax cuts led policymakers to cut their K-12 funding per pupil by 23% between 2008 and 2017 after adjusting for inflation. So that is now among the chief reasons that Arizona currently pays teachers less than any other state. In North Carolina, an onslaught of tax cuts starting back in 2013 has just drained billions from really vital public services like K-12 schools and higher education, which has led to lagging teacher pay along with rising college tuition and student debt. And then in Ohio, 15 years of tax cuts had added up to $7 billion in foregone revenue each year as of 2020. So over that same period, the state's ranking in areas like children's access to preschool and young people's ability to afford college dropped substantially because the state had to make cuts to make up for all of that lost revenue. So proponents of tax cuts will often argue that there are long-term payoffs in prosperity or growth, but the evidence just is not there. Of the 5 states that cut income taxes most sharply in the 2010s, so Kansas, Maine, North Carolina, Ohio, and Wisconsin, 4 of those saw slower growth in jobs and personal income than the US at large in the years that followed those cuts. Kansas is a particularly salient example. So I want to dig in here for a second. Lawmakers there approved really massive tax cuts in 2012 and 2013 that were sold in large part by claims that they were going to deliver a shot of adrenaline to the state's economy, as their governor at the time put it. But it just didn't turn out that way. Instead, the state's private sector lagged behind neighboring states and the nation overall for the next few years. And then to deal with the revenue losses, the state imposed really unprecedented cuts in public services across the board. The harm in Kansas was so severe that in 2017, a bipartisan majority of lawmakers voted to override their governor's veto and roll back most of the tax cuts to put the state back on firmer ground. Also, I want you guys to know that I can't see the chat while I'm presenting, but we are going to have Q&A after this. And so I'll be able to come back to any questions that you drop in there. And then finally, I wanted to note here that states that are completely without an income tax haven't fared any better. So over the course of the 2010s, the 9 states with the highest top marginal income tax rates saw their economies grow slightly faster on average than the 9 no income tax states. This is true of growth in the overall size of these states' economies, and more importantly, of economic growth per person. Average incomes have also grown more quickly in states with the highest top tax rates. And in 2019, just before the start of the pandemic, the official unemployment rate was also slightly lower in the high rate states at 3.4% than in the no tax states at 3.8%. So these are obviously really slight differences. So it's not necessarily to point out that taxing at this higher rate is necessarily going to spur economic growth. It's not a causative relationship, but it does point to the fact that cutting those income taxes isn't actually helping that growth, right? So we know that it is possible to both tax folks at a higher rate and be able to get in those revenues to spend on really needed projects in your state, and also to see consistent economic growth year to year. And so when you hear arguments that are saying otherwise, it's just not backed up by what we see across the country and what we have seen over the last few decades. So just overall, income tax opponents tend to overstate the impact that income taxes have on state economies and underappreciate the economic importance of investments in education and in infrastructure and other public services that are funded with income taxes. So instead of cutting those taxes, states looking to become stronger and to build inclusive economies that deliver for everyone over the long term should both increase and protect their tax revenues. So many states took steps over the last year and a half during the pandemic that really illustrate what those policies can look like and set an example for Kentucky in how to make the most of the current surplus and the availability of federal funding that you guys still have. So first things first, sharply limit tax cutting. While the state might want to consider expanding tax credits that are targeted to low-income people, like an earned income tax credit, to supplement other pandemic-related investments that are focused on people who are hit the hardest by the pandemic and that ultimately lessen income inequality, tax cuts generally should be avoided at a time like this, where there's really high need and there's money available for truly transformative investments. Secondly, you should raise taxes on folks who can afford it. So instead of cutting income taxes, we've seen that states can help create stronger, more equitable economies by raising taxes on corporate interests and high income earners. This can generate substantial revenue over time, which is also disproportionately from white taxpayers who are earning the most. And those public investments can improve schools and infrastructure, particularly in communities of color, which are often underinvested in. And it ultimately increases family incomes and otherwise just helps to build an economy where benefits are widely shared. And then finally, I would really encourage Kentucky to prioritize equity-focused investments in people. So lawmakers should target surplus revenue and unallocated federal aid to investments that help Kentuckians still fighting the effects of the pandemic and that support a robust and equitable recovery. And so many states are using the funds that they have available right now to address really long-standing challenges, like a lack of affordable housing and inadequate access to mental health services. And these investments hold the most promise for creating a strong recovery and also for addressing systemic economic and racial inequities. Simply storing most of Kentucky's surplus revenue in the state's rainy day fund or using it to contribute more than the actuarial requirement into state pension funds is honestly just a waste of this really historic opportunity. You are now looking at billions more in unexpected available resources to address priorities in the state budget. And so smart, people-centered investments right now can counteract the rounds of budget cuts that Kentucky has made since the Great Recession and set the state up for a more prosperous and competitive future. So I'd like to just close with this quote from our current president. State policy has really just never been race neutral or class neutral or gender neutral, and it still isn't today. So it's your responsibility and really your opportunity to build a tax system that represents Kentuckians' shared values. I am really looking forward to seeing what questions you guys have in the Q&A portion of this conversation, and to just being in deeper conversation with you about how to leverage this really exciting chance to grow Kentucky's prosperity. I'm going to turn it over now to Remy.
Thanks, Whitney. Fantastic setup in many ways to what I'm going to share. I'm also going to attempt to use PowerPoint with limited screens, and we'll see how that goes. Let's get started here. All right. You all see my first slide. I think you do. So Anna did a fantastic.
I can only see you right now, Remy.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Uh-huh.
Can you see the correct slide, not my notes?
I see your notes and the whole thing right now.
Okay. Hang on a second here.
Audience, we promise we practice everything and it does not matter.
Yeah, it worked for me to try again by pressing the slideshow button and then clicking presenter view once you were already inside
Exactly.
of the presentation.
All right, move this out of the way. All right, now do you see it?
With your notes.
Huh. All right, let's switch. How about that?
Haha, now I see a topos screen in front of me.
Thank you, Natalie. So, all right, Anna did a great job introing me and Topos, but I wanted to give you a little bit more context about Topos. We develop strategies designed to tackle the cultural challenges we face. So in short, we conduct research that helps us figure out how to change how people think so we can advance a progressive worldview and progressive policies. We work alongside advocates like you to co-create strategies based on research insights. We've worked with the Kentucky Center for many years, co-creating strategies based on research into Kentucky's unique culture, which meant some visits, which I love, to Kentucky and really talking to folks all across your state. So in my presentation, I'm going to review the top strategies for effective communication about budgets, taxes, the economy, fighting austerity. It's going to be a lot, but don't worry about memorizing everything. It's really the concepts that we're focused on. So let's start with the landscape of where we are as advocates. We're always on the defense, whether it's good times or bad times. In bad times, we have to sacrifice. And it's always a bad time to raise taxes. We can't afford, we're told we can't afford to raise wages, invest in schools, etc. In good times, we have to prove efficiencies if we want to make new investments. We have to show how investing now will save us money later. We're always fighting over small pieces of an ever-shrinking pie, and we're told handouts don't help. These are the cultural common sense challenges. Responsible people live within their means, debt threatens economic well-being, and taxes take money out of the economy. We like to think about all of this at a different level, as the cultural common sense. What are the broadly shared ideas that are so pervasive, they don't seem like persuasion or spin. They just seem like simple common sense. And yet, these ideas have power to influence our behavior. What are other common sense ideas that you have to contend with? If you want to throw them into chat, we'll come back to them later as we have our discussion. So this is what we're up against across the country and our culture. It's really hostile discourse. You'll see one of your home state senators quoted there, but this is really in the culture, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, independent, these ideas are in the culture, and it creates a hostile environment for advocates to operate in when there's austerity, or in your situation where you actually have a budget surplus. But we can go on offense. And to do that, we have to provide bold solutions. We have to center people's lives. We have to talk about economic well-being in meaningful ways. We have to surface how government action supports thriving communities and how working together, collective action, leads to measurable change. The narrative that we're all building together crosses issue silos. To win, we have to take into account a lot of cross-cutting common sense ideas. Ideas about the role of government, ideas about taxes and budgets, about racial justice, racism, the economy. All of those are things that we need to address to make progress on the cultural ideas that are pervasive in our country and in Kentucky. When people consider taxes, for example, they simply think of money out of their pocket. It goes into the black hole of this thing called government. Because they have largely forgotten about what government is and does, it is easy to trigger concerns about how the money will be spent. When we talk about the need for taxes, it is essential to extend the sight line. It is not about money for government, it's about thriving communities, economic well-being, etc. Again, we have to extend people's line of sight from government to communities. For example, we found that people are energized when reminded that thriving communities depend on the foundations we build together, like schools, parks, roads, healthcare, and so on. This is the image we want to inspire, not squabbling elites. Taxes aren't about dollars, cents, and budget shortfalls. They aren't about who gets what. Public revenue is about the lifeblood of our communities. We have to displace politics with a richer perspective of the myriad ways we work through government to create the society we want. Right now, our culture has a skewed and limited picture of what government is and does. The dominant image tends to be bickering, corrupt elites, not policies or systems. Reminding people of the things we're accomplishing together isn't just feel good, it's empowering. It reminds people of their agency, how civic responsibility plays out in everyday life. So this is one of my favorite political quotes. It's about the economy, stupid. People are nervous about the economy, and public spending is key to helping the economy recover. Public spending is good for the economy, as Whitney and Pam mentioned. These are short examples of little statements of how to express the idea of the connection between having robust tax revenue and the economy. We can kickstart our economic well-being by supporting small businesses and, your example, we will rebound faster if we keep money flowing to communities. Cutting jobs, teachers, firefighters, nurses will make the recovery harder. If we want to keep money flowing into communities, we have to explain how government money helps the economy, essentially Keynesian economics, without getting wonky like that. People need to be at the center of the explanation with shared benefits to whole communities. These ideas are expressed as metaphors, sometimes ideal as visuals, as our Washington partners did on this slide, where they've actually shown the flow of money from collecting revenue collectively and pumping that money into communities. It's also about fixing the upside down tax code so the wealthy few kick in their part. The flow of money gets stuck at the top and smart policies get it circulating through our families and communities. Upside down is also a metaphor that leads to progressive policies instead of asserting fair, which is in the eye of the beholder. To the rich, it isn't fair to take money from job creators. It also provides reassurance that most won't pay. You can see a little statement there on the slide, and this is language we also tested in Kentucky in the past. And then you see an editorial cartoon from Alabama from about a decade ago when there was a fight to create an income tax in Alabama. So we're going to hopefully show a short video, which is an example of how people in the community respond to these ideas. Whitney really set it up with the data of where states made different choices in response to the recession, the early 2000s recession. So I'm going to read to you first what we told people out in the community. We read a short paragraph to them and then asked them to respond. So the paragraph is, Maine, this is Mainers in this video, had many of the same problems as, Minnesota had many of the same problems as Maine. Of aging population and industries had left. So they raised the income tax rate 2% from 8 to 10 for households making over 250,000 and raised the minimum wage. They plowed a third of the money into education, did away with the deficit, and invested in creating the sorts of communities that employees and employers both want. This helped create almost 30 times the jobs his tax-cutting predecessor did, and Forbes now ranks Minnesota as one of the top 10 best states for business. All right, Natalie, if you want to try and share that. Oh, that looks wrong.
Sorry about that. That is one of those things that you just don't want to happen.
You know what we can
and it
do,
does.
Natalie? We can put the link in, and it's about 90 seconds, and folks can look at it on their own screen.
Oh, I've got it. It's just
Okay.
that I hit the wrong button. I was trying to unmute, and that's when it decided it was going to do that instead. So let me screen share once again. I'm sorry, you all.
I wish that we would do that. It sounds amazing. Do it. Okay, that is my reaction to it.
I mean, if somebody's used it and it's worked, too often we have these.
They got a new governor, and he actually raised the percent on people who make above $250,000 a year from 8% to 10%, and they raised the minimum wage. And what happened is they created like almost 200,000 jobs because they got burnt.
Well, it should be when it's people.
I wish that we would do that. It sounds amazing. Do it. Okay, that is my reaction to it.
I mean, if somebody's used it and it's worked, too often we have these theoretical ideas that when we put them in as a pilot, they don't seem to work. So if it worked in Minnesota.
Well, after talking about Minnesota, that really surprised me. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Ways that we can try to help get our government to do more of the way they did it. Go talk to the people in Minnesota and how they did it.
Totally positive, you know. If such thing like that works, the other side obviously gonna work here because people need kind of support around here. I think that would be more helpful to support the middle class to coming up, and that would be perfect if they apply that here.
If that's, what Minnesota is aiming to do, and the proof is in the pudding, as they say, that it resulted in job creation, and increased wages, sure, increased taxes, but we're enhancing the opportunities for everybody to have a piece of the pie.
I mean, I think it's really kind of amazing. It seems, in the moment, I feel like people think it seems so big to do, like to make the cut or to take a little bit of money out of this in order to do this, but it definitely is obviously beneficial to the bigger picture. It can be done, like in a bigger sense where everyone can be in a good financial state, everyone can have a good job, everyone can get their education if we just are willing to make the sacrifice for the short time meeting.
Thank you, Natalie. Well, hopefully most of you can see that. I'd be really curious to hear in the chat folks' responses to what they saw on the video. What that was the sort of our core research, which is going out to communities and giving people different ideas to compete with the cultural common sense that exists. As silly as it is, things like trickle-down economics are really cemented into people's brains, and this is a way of competing with it. All right, I'm going to try and share my slides again. I have a couple more. Okay, what are you all looking at?
You can see your notes again.
All right. You got the right one now?
Yep.
Okay. So moving on, clearly there's an overlap between racial equity and austerity thinking. We recognize that across issue areas, progressive communicators are working hard to incorporate race-forward messages into their communications. And when it comes to revenue and budget policy, it's particularly important to bring race and class into the conversation. For example, tax policy has a great deal of power to either narrow or broaden wealth disparities. And budget decisions can determine which communities get investment and which get neglected. We have a responsibility and opportunity to spark change by helping people better understand the consequences of tax and budget policies and shine a light on solutions. There's power in shining a light on how revenue system is unjust and how spending decisions have racist outcomes. The next two slides have two examples of explanations on both sides of the ledger. This slide shows language we tested in Washington State about 2 months ago, incorporating components of the race class narrative and adapting to the history of Washington State. It includes a clear explanation of how racist policies in the tax code led to different outcomes for BIPOC communities and thriving communities writ large. So I'm gonna pause so you can read this. It's long, but it is important because it has the explanation that ties together the spending and the tax components. I'm going to move on, and we'll share these slides with everyone after, so you can read these at your leisure. Next one is on unjust spending. So it focuses more on how spending differences make a difference in the outcomes, and it ties and it creates an explanation of how these spending differences have racist outcomes. So there's a lot more to do clearly here, but and an issue challenging as racism requires many narrative strategies, and there are lots of great folks doing great work. The Kirwan Institute and others creating awareness of implicit bias, the Othering and Belonging Institute, advancing targeted universalism, Heather McGee's interdependence framing, the idea of abundance from the Insight Center, we make the future with the race-class narrative, and so on. But these are some good starters and things that you should consider using. All right, so just to review, these are ideas and strategies that should be adapted in your own words. There's some language that we have found powerful and metaphors that we found powerful that you consider using, but it really is important for you to adopt these ideas in your own language with your own examples that are specific to Kentucky. So the things that we want to practice later are focusing on avoiding the things on the top instead of orienting around problems, centering around budgets and shortfalls, the government getting in the weeds about programs, resentment of the wealthy, and aid and helping those who are hurting. What we want to shift to is focusing on aspirations, successes, solutions, centering economic well-being, community, using explanations, tying together concepts, and pragmatic choices. We will share a cheat sheet for the breakout when we get to that point, but I'm going to stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Remy. Is your presentation done for now?
It is. I'm trying to get it off the screen.
I appreciate all of you dealing with so many technical difficulties, especially our panelists. And yes, we did practice everything, but it still is always difficult. Including because of those technical difficulties, we're a little bit behind where I thought we would be at this point. So instead of having a Q&A before we go into break, what I'm going to do is condense the Q&A with the workshop, which comes after our break. And before we go into break, which will be 10 minutes long, I'm going to give you a couple instructions because I'm going to ask something of you during the break. So first of all, be thinking about questions that you have for our panelists today. So after the break, we'll come back and you can ask those. And then also, I would like for any of you who are willing to come off of mute and share share a story that you'd like to be able to tell using some of these more constructive narrative principles. I'd love to have you come off of Zoom and share what you're working with and get some feedback from Remy and others about how to strengthen your arguments. And then the third thing I want to ask you before you go on your break is to use a couple Jamboards. I'm going to share the links for those in the chat. Make sure I have the right chat here. So what you'll do is these are Google documents that you can navigate to. I'm about to post the second one in there as well. And at the top of each of these Jamboards is a question. That didn't work. Nope. So I would love for you to think about those questions and then use a feature that I'm going to show you on there in a second. Let's see. I'm assuming most of you have used Jamboards before, but just in case not, I'm going to share my screen and show you how to do this. So I'm hoping that you all can see this. Here's one of the Jamboards that has a question at the top. I've got the other one up there too. But what you do is you just come, here's my cursor. I'm coming over here to the left-hand side. I'm going to click on this little sticky note icon. It allows me to create a little sticky note that I add my thoughts, my answers to the question to the board. So please do that for one or both of these Jamboards. We're going to leave this session open, so you don't have to go anywhere. If you don't have two screens or you don't want to get on the Jamboard on your phone or whatever, you can also just put your answers in the chat. I'll post the questions in the chat as well, so you can see them there. So there are just a number of ways to contribute to our conversation after we come back from the break. We need to say anything. Am I leaving anything unsaid? Is anything confusing before we go on our break?
Anna, when I look at the Jamboard, I have a view only.
Okay.
And I have to request edit access, it says.
Oh, I see. Let me change. You're right. I thought I changed it, but I didn't. Great job, Pam. Okay, I'll change the access on both of those. So you all should be able to add your comments to those now. All right. Let me know if that works. Okay.
Yep, that's good now.
Okay, thank you. It is 1:32. We'll come back at 1:42 for the last 15, 17 minutes of conversation, and I really look forward to hearing from you all. All right, we're going to pause and mute ourselves for 10 minutes. Okay, I'm glad to be back with you all. I'll invite all of our experts to come off of mute, or at least to put your camera on, and then we can come off mute when we're talking. But now starts the portion of our session where we get to answer some questions and interact around the ideas that have come up during today's presentation. So I would like for us to start, Remy, with the Jamboard exploring what's the one thing you will do less of, or what will you focus on instead? Can we start there?
Yeah. And perhaps we can even call on people to explain, to unpack their answers. I really am curious about the frame that our way creates prosperity, which I think I understand, but I'd love to hear the person who posted that talk about it a little bit more and how they might apply it.
And the way to do that is to raise your hand, and then I can unmute you. So if you're the person that said claim the frame that our way creates prosperity, all right, I see that hand being raised, and let me see if I can figure out how to, what do I do next? Is that Jason Bailey? All right, I will unmute Jason. Let me see how I can. Natalie, I'm having trouble unmuting. Oh, you got it. Thanks, Natalie. Great.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking, listening to Whitney's going over the, what the research says. I just feel like we're always too timid about just saying that our way is better. We want to, we know it works, right? When you invest in people and you, invest in infrastructure and health and all these things, it does make us more prosperous. But we want to sometimes like let them have the economy, and we'll just take, we'll help people and they do the economy stuff. And I think we just lose. So how do you just claim that it's better for everything and everybody, including the economy, while also suffusing that idea with, what the economy is, which is people and their well-being. So long way of saying what I was trying to get at.
Thanks, Jason. And fantastic. And the video that we shared, one of the things I was hoping you saw is the excitement of Mainers. And I'm not a Mainer, but they would tell you that they're kind of pessimistic folks in general, and particularly around the economy. But they were, shouting, let's do that, when they heard this example of what happened in Minnesota, which was really claiming, our role in the economy. And then I noticed this in the chat. Someone was curious about, and this is certainly the case usually in Washington State, about comparisons to other states not always working. In this case, when people, and we tested it all across the country, when people understand how different states make different choices, they actually latch onto it as a way of explaining how governments actually, investments from governments actually spur the economy. So it displaces the trickle-down idea. So there are times when you actually can use examples from other states in effective ways.
I do just want to call out this point that Barbara was making in the chat, though, about particularly pointing out stats where your state is doing negatively, right? I used to work in South Carolina and then North Carolina, and we saw it all the time, right? Like I would go in to speak to a legislator, and as soon as you said, well, this state is doing great and our state is now, 43rd and whatever, they were always like, oh, well, the circumstances are different here, right? And so I think kind of tying this to the first point that was brought up, that if we focus on the numbers a little more, if we talk more about the economy, I think that there is less of that personal attachment to it, right? So I'm not saying that, this state has failed people because of the way that we live. I'm saying that we have a choice point here, and these people made this choice, to what Remy is saying, and these people made this choice, and like we can decide to be like these folks or like these folks, you know, not necessarily saying we see these bad outcomes because of all of these, you know, terrible choices that you made in the past, but like where we are right now, we have a chance to move forward in a different way, and these are the reasons that I think we should, right? And just keeping it really focused on how things could be better, I think is better than focusing on why things have gotten so particularly bad.
Thank you, Whitney. Anna, do you want me to pick another one or do you want to pick another?
Sure, I was just going to comment what you were both saying, and then a lot of the what I'm seeing here on this Jamboard is a good reminder to me. You know, we as a policy organization, we are often in the role of sharing those dismal statistics and saying, look, this is what those austerity policies get you. But I really appreciate our audience's feedback on, like, you know, the importance of claiming that visionary narrative and focusing on what can be done to improve things.
I have a question that I think would be relevant based on what we heard or what we all heard yesterday when we were watching, which is the whole narrative that Chairman Petrie was using about that the taxpayers have lent their money and they need to be paid back. I was thinking, yes, and the way you pay them back is by investing. Is that a good thing to say?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic thing to say. And I think just, you know, extending the explanation a little bit more, which you would do, Pam, but that making sure that people understand that investing in communities brings jobs through childcare, you know, you give some examples. But yeah, I think that is very effective, and it's shown to be true in our research around the country. People, no matter where they are ideologically, hold these ideas, and it's incumbent on us to displace them with other ideas. I saw, let's see, I'm looking on my other screen, which is super tiny. I'm curious about the focus less on the tax to the rich messaging and focus more on helping people understand who really pays taxes now. I talked about upside down tax code, which you all have. And I was chatting with Anna a little bit on the side when Pam was doing her presentation, that essentially rich people, rich special interests are trying to carve out more special breaks that will make your tax code even more upside down. So anyone want to talk about that one? Raise your hand, or did I sufficiently explain that one?
So that was actually mine.
Yeah.
And, you know, it just really strikes me that I think that, and there are some other comments about this too, that the top line message of taxes are bad is that people just accept that, and that to get to the point of, but really look at what taxes you pay kind of thing requires more words, more explanation that gets you too far into the weeds and you lose people. So is there a comparable way?
Yeah, the shorthand is the upside down tax code, but you have to explain it with a little bit of detail. So, you know, upside down tax code, which requires more of those who have less income than those at the top. And in Kentucky, this means that those with less income pay 3 times more in their taxes than those at the top. I just threw out that 3%. I might be right from historical memory. And that the choices that those in the legislature are making are going to make that worse.
I think also whenever you can, we've seen it be effective in states when they bring it down to an example of a single type of family compared to another single type of family at a different income level, right? So I think that kind of helps to humanize it, the way that people kind of feel humanized when you get on Twitter and you see that, like, oh, you know, Donald Trump paid $35 in taxes and I paid $3,000, like that it's easier to compare when you do that, because I think sometimes it can be hard for people to kind of see themselves as part of the bottom 90% of their tax pool, right? Because most people think of themselves as middle income, regardless of what their income actually is, right? So when you can give those sort of concrete examples of like a family of 3 at this income level, a family of 3 at this income level, and what they are paying in those taxes, it makes it a little bit simpler for folks to understand and really hold on to.
Anna, why don't you tee up the next one? Do you see
Right.
one?
Okay, so we have time for maybe 1, maybe 2 more folks to come off mute and share more about their idea here. I wanted to hear more from the person who was connecting between this and maybe another panel I went to this morning. Target working women and young families with the message that public investments in the care industry will help them prosper. If you went to the care economy panel this morning, we know that we are sorely lacking in public investment in that critical sector of our economy, and those workers are deeply underpaid. And well, now I'm doing the job. Who wants to talk more about it? Can you raise your hand and I'll take you off, or Natalie can take you off mute. Is no one going to claim it? You can raise your hand by clicking the little hand icon at the bottom of the screen.
It looks like there's a in the chat. So I'm curious. I think the reason why Anna and I are both curious to hear more is whether the question is about how do you encourage mobilizing those folks, or is it about how do you explain the value of investing in those folks to the larger community? And I'd say basically probably the same thing for both. You want to have a pretty consistent message. That prosperity comes from having folks in those communities, in communities that are invested in, that will create thriving economies everywhere. Rhonda.
This is Ted. Actually, I'm on Rhonda's account. After the earlier session, it just seemed obvious to me, and a little bit of my background before I retired was in messaging, so I'm always kind of in that mode. That this is an audience that could be reached with that kind of a talking point, if you will.
And so you're saying the audience being young families, the audience being working women who are not
young
seeing that
families,
value?
not only with children, but maybe with parents or grandparents. Because as was pointed out earlier, that's a situation too in a lot of families.
Yeah, I think you're right that making those connections and how that affects people's ability to work and engage in the economy. I think that's a very important way of sort of understanding and explaining how tax money flows through an economy and boosts our economy overall.
And brings it home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, people intimately, deeply understand that when they and their loved ones are cared for, and then the people who are doing the caring are getting paid adequately, that everything works better. Everything works better. We've all known that for a long, or maybe not all of us have known it for a long time, but we've certainly become more familiar with that during the pandemic.
Anna, can I ask Ted to sort of take a crack at the full explanation?
Mm-hmm.
Are you willing to do that, Ted?
Oh, you're asking me to think on my feet. I'm more of a ponderer.
You were there. You started to go there.
I think the pieces are there. Why don't we make these public investments in the care industry, child care, elder care, you name it, to give families more of an opportunity, to prosper and thrive and accumulate wealth.
That's great. Anna, any additions to that?
not off the top of my head. I thought it was very concise and compelling. Yeah.
That's funny because that was actually wordier than I would like it, but at least it's something to work with.
It is, I would say, you'll notice that some of our messages are a little bit more wordy, but that's important, and they can be expressed in shorter ways. And we've worked on folks expressing this in tweets, but you really have to tie together explanations for people to get these other bad cultural common sense ideas out of their mind.
While you were chatting, I did think of something. Just one thing that I've learned from you, Remy, and have tried to practice when I'm remembering myself, is the importance of weaving into those messages the knowledge that we've done this sort of thing before and we can do it again. We know it works. And a good example in the in this sphere of when we work together to take care of our children and give them a good start, one of the things that I always like to talk about is the Kentucky Education Reform Act, where we put a ton of money into schools. Well, and there, the good example of what some of the federal relief during COVID has done for childcare is a great way to say, we know this works. We've done it before and we can do it again and we can make it permanent. And we need to make those investments at childcare at the state level. Yes, Whitney is reminding me that she has to leave. We've all got to leave to get onto our next exciting session, which is our keynote with Annie Lowry. So I have a couple of closing notes for us all. Thank you all so much for being here today, our wonderful panelists, all of our participants, for your input and your participation. Let's see, I've lost my notes. Yes, like I said, our next session is our last one. It's our keynote with Annie Lowry. It's on the same link, but we do have to end this one. We have to close it down to open that one back up. Well, so use the same link to come back at 2:15 to hear from Annie Lowry. And thanks again for being here, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Happy to be here.
For everyone who's left, just to let you know, I am going to close this out right now. We will be back in 15 minutes. But for right now, we're going to close this session out. So we'll be back in 15 minutes. Hopes to see you all then. And thank you so much for being here.